So just by way of background to HS2 Action Alliance, it is a campaigning group that works in conjunction with the national action groups and other action groups such as Stop HS2 on the national picture. HS2 Action Alliance has in particular been focusing on evidence-based scrutiny of the government's case for the proposals for HS2. We're very fortunate to have, as part of HS2 Action Alliance, Hilary, Wharf and Bruce Weston, who have spent 20 years working as consultants in the transport industry, have great contacts and great knowledge. They've produced, over the course of this campaign so far, a number of very helpful documents, which I think have been received very warmly and have been regarded as very professional pieces of work from people across the transport industry. They've produced a review of the wider economic impact of HS2. They've produced a review of alternatives to HS2 and more capacity that can be delivered on the West Coast Main Line. They've produced a review on the consultation that went out on the exceptional hardship scheme and proposed an alternative compensation solution, which was incredibly well researched, very professionally done, and provides a basis for much of the response that HS2 Action Alliance and others gave to the consultation on the exceptional hardship scheme. And now they've produced a second review of the business case for HS2. We're extremely grateful to the work that Hilary and Bruce have done, which has all been provided pro bono over the course of the last year. Thank you.
What I'd like to say, first of all, about the new business case is that this is an initial assessment. So this is an initial assessment that we've done 2 weeks in. Now, I'm quite sure by the time that we've finished getting more information through all the Freedom of Information requests, there will be some changes to it. But we certainly couldn't have done it without knowing an enormous amount about the business case from what the DfT and HS2 Limited produced last year. So, let's have a look at what the main headlines are in relation to this new business case that's been produced for consultation purposes. The first point is the new case is very substantially worse than the old. Secondly, the main change that's been done by DfT is to the demand forecast. But as we'll see, it's still substantially overstated, we believe. Thirdly, almost all the original concerns that we raised in the original report we did, a 45-page report, which was also confirmed by FTI Consulting, almost all those original concerns remain in this new business case. And particular ones that we're going to have a look at are the fact that the DfT still account all the time spent on trains as wasted. We will also see that the alternatives, and by that I mean the alternatives of improving the existing infrastructure, those alternatives remain hidden and misrepresented in the data and the documents we're given. Thirdly, and I think this is particularly relevant to the local authorities, the existing rail services are going to suffer. And fourthly, this much talked of north-south divide, there is no evidence on how the new business case will improve the north-south divide. And this, we're going to see, raises a very substantial point of actually, are these materials not fit for purpose of an open consultation on which we can all give proper, robust responses? And there are a couple of other aspects which I will just conclude with. So, let's take the first and perhaps one of the most important ones, when I said we've got a worse business case. Now, by that, we talk about it in terms of value for money. And value for money, how it gets quantified as far as the business case is concerned, is in a single statistic, the net benefit ratio, the NBR, as people will often hear it called. Now, let's look first of all at the left-hand side of the slide. where we'll see phase 1, the London to West Midlands phase, and then on the right-hand side we have the full Y, when it's going forward to Leeds and Manchester. So looking first at phase 1. Okay, the benefits were, back last year, substantial. They were 28.7 billion without the wider economic benefits, which was a small addition. And we'll see those benefits have been very substantially cut. They're now just 16.5 billion. And the costs, however, are hardly changed. Indeed, they're not showing us changed at all there, whereas in fact there is a slight netting off because the tunnelling was slightly cheaper and that paid for the HS2 development that was there. Thirdly, the key item of the subsidy. Now this is the net cost to the government, and the net cost to the government has gone down slightly. 11.9 billion becomes 10.3. But because the benefits are so substantially reduced, this has had a devastating effect on the NBR, the net benefit ratio. And as you'll see, instead of it being the much vaunted more than £2 benefit for every £1 cost, so instead of it being 2.4, it's now become 1.6. So in terms of value for money, it has dropped by 1/3. So phase 1 is 1/3 worse in terms of value for money. You'll see it just scrapes the marker of 2, 2.7 going down to 2, it just scrapes the marker of 2 when you include the wider economic impacts, which we'll have a look at later. Now let's see what happened to the full Y. Well, there you will see on the right-hand side this figure of 43.7 billion. Now that is this £44 billion that was much vaunted and much talked about in the publicity on the 28th of February when Hammond announced the new business case. £44 billion worth of benefits, he said, there will be for the full Y. However, what you didn't hear him talk about was the 73 billion, which was what it was last March. So there was a huge reduction also in the benefits for the full Y. And these benefits, this big reduction is being driven, we'll see shortly, is being driven by the new demand forecast that has been produced. The costs you'll see on the Y are slightly increased, and that is because of Heathrow. The subsidy, very little change. And of course, what's happened to the net benefit ratio for the Y is it's nearly halved. So it's gone down from 4 to 2.2. So it just scrapes in over the marker of 2. And 2 is an important marker because it means then that it can be classed as good value for money. So in terms of the business case, it's pretty clear. It's worse. Now, the key change, as I said, was a revised demand forecast. And it's actually quite good because it's pretty simple what's happened. What they've done, what DfT have done, is they've assumed the lower economic growth, which are the figures from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and they've also included the higher fares, where everyone will remember the RPI plus 3% that we're all having for 3 years. So those two factors had to be taken account of in the demand forecast. So you might say, well, how did they do it? So let's look at last year. Last year, in March 2010, we had, as you'll see there, a background growth rate of 133% to 2033. And that gave us this equivalent annual growth of 3.3% per annum. And what we were concerned about, particularly, was that rate appeared to be about twice what other respected experts were saying. So we felt it was substantially too high. Now, what they did was, in effect, take a doubling of growth. You'll see the 102%, which is the figure it now is, but they stretched it out for another 10 years. So instead of having the cut-off at 2033, it stretches out to 2043. And that, we would argue, is unacceptable. Now, of course, what it does do is it makes the equivalent annual rate, it comes down to a figure of 2%. And you might say, well, that's more in line. But what we'll do is have a look and see that actually we still believe there is a substantial overestimate inside this demand forecast. But just to conclude where you get to with the total figure of the demand forecast, previously we had 267% in total because you have to include the uplift that comes from just having HS2 itself. And that figure itself has gone down a bit, but we're still talking about 216%. So what are these issues with this new forecast? Well, first of all, as we've said, we are extending the period. Now, we're extending this period using what is a short-term rail model to compensate for the lower economic growth. Now, Roy Eddington, which many of you will know of, in 2006 was concerned about people doing it was concerned about spreading it for more than 10 years. And we know that in March 2010, when we had the previous business case, they stretched it to 25 years, i.e. from 2008 up to 2033. But what's now happened is it's been stretched to 35 years. And perhaps a simple statistic on that is worth thinking about. If the cut-off had remained at 25 years, instead of having that 102% increase in demand, it would have been just 65%. And of course, what's happening is that in doing this, they are ignoring the fact that there is saturating demand for travel. Now, I don't mean rail travel, I mean travel overall. For the last 15 years has been flattening and has saturated. And what it's done is it ignored that evidence. But perhaps the very crucial point is that it is using an out-of-date forecasting model. There are versions of what's called PDFH, which is the Passenger Demand Forecasting Handbook, and the current version is called version 5. And that has particular forecasting factors in it. And what it says is, we don't believe that when you have extra long journeys, that there should be an additional factor that you should extend the growth for. Now, what's happened is that they are using the previous version, which is version 4.1. But very recently, new research came out. And that new research by Oxera and Arup, together with DFT and done for DFT, has confirmed that actually it's the PDF version 5 which is the correct one. So the use of these out-of-date forecasting factors has materially increased the forecast that we have. And to give you another statistic on that, if we had said, OK, it's not 102%, the increase in demand, what would it be if we used this latest version 5 factors? And the answer would be just 57%. So as you can see, we've got two very substantial factors, both extending the period and the use of out-of-date forecasting factors, which are upping this forecast. And together, those two factors will take it down from just over 100% to about 38%. We also have some interesting aspects to do with the historic base. Believe it or not, in the current business case, the history has changed. No longer do we have the same 45,000 passengers per day as our starting point. They have now become 50,000. And this is one of several questions which we are investigating further, because it would seem odd that you could say that history has changed. Finally, there's just a point about the distribution of where